Probably one of the main things that Zappa's early career helped to do was to deconstruct the rock format as it was at the time when he first moved into it, and rebuild it as something entirely new.
So much nowadays we see pop artists and rock musicians as puppets of the music industry, and Zappa was never a puppet. He was always the man in charge, the man coming up with the new ideas so fresh and advanced of their time, ahead of their time, that even now we're still learning from him.
I don't think it's a particularly good story. I don't think what Frank Zappa did in the early years or late years has been particularly well understood, that it's interpreted as satire, whereas in fact what it's saying, any expression is fairly objective and you can think about it. And that request for reflection and thought about the pop music we consume doesn't seem to have had very many followers.
Frank Zappa and the Mothers, they were rock's early teens. They were the adolescents for rock. It was a difficult, stormy adolescence, and probably a little more dependent on smutty books than most people's adolescence. But it did drag pop from being a smiley little boy into maybe a darker, more interesting adult.
Well, Frank Zappa's early musical influences were very important to the way he developed as an artist. I mean, it's very difficult to categorise who Frank Zappa is. Is he a great composer? Is he a great guitarist or producer? So many hats that he's worn during his long career. So the early influences really kind of set up the way he worked himself.
I think Zappa's early influences were probably the rock and roll and doo-wop of his youth. I mean, that actually pans out in a lot of the stuff that he did later on. And he always quotes Edgar Varese as being a great influence on him as a classical composer, and I think some of that comes through as well. I think those would be his main points.
I hadn't been raised in an environment where there was a lot of music in the house. This couple that owned the chili place, Opal and Chester, agreed to ask the man who serviced the jukebox to put in some of the song titles that I liked, because I promised that I would dutifully keep pumping quarters into this thing so I could listen to him. And so I had the ability to eat good chili and listen to 3 Hours Past Midnight by Johnny Guitar Watson.
When I went up to talk to Zappa, when my book, The Negative Dialectics of Poodle Play, was going to be published, he was playing, or rather I was let in by one of his studio technicians, and they were playing Edgar Varese, the modern classical composer who wrote music mainly in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century. That was playing downstairs, very abstract music, a lot of percussion, weird silences in it. Then when I went upstairs to actually meet Frank, because he was very ill from his prostate cancer at the time, it was shortly before he died, he was playing the Flamingos, which is a doo-wop group, all vocals with kind of extraordinary falsettos and so on. So you put those two together and you go modern classical music and doo-wop. I think, especially the way not many people will put those two things together, you've got two primary influences for Frank Zappa musically.
Also, lyrically, the TV had an enormous effect on him. The advertisers, the politicians, the televangelists, basically anyone who was lying, he saw them and thought, well, I must lampoon these people. He saw through what they were doing. And throughout his career, that was what he did. He kind of, he kind of pricked through hypocrisy in everywhere he saw it, whether it be from the straight world or the counterculture that were championing him.
Your mind is totally controlled. It has been stuffed into my mold, and you will do as you are told until the rights to you are sold. Take it away, Frank.
That's right, folks. Don't touch that dial. I am the spy from the radio. Who's been along?
It was just a real bizarre concoction of forms. He brought them all together in what could be called a commercial way at a time when he was incredibly at odds with what was going on, but skillfully he found an audience. I think the Mothers were incredibly important in the development of pop music, I guess, really, because this was the first time that they were kind of intellectualising what was a very naive medium at the time into what became known as rock music. There was a strange collision of established jazz players and musical primitives, and it was just very odd. They weren't the kind of people you would normally see in a band. They weren't wearing nice little clean suits, and they really were freaks in every sense. They had longer hair than anybody had ever seen on anybody before, and the primitive image fitted the primitive nature of a lot of what they were doing.
He fell out with them, which means that in retrospect people try and diminish the Mothers of Invention. I find it quite odd in the Ryko disc reissue series, you get Frank Zappa's face on every CD, and that's not quite right for how it felt when you bought a Mothers of Invention album right at the beginning. When you opened up Freak Out or Absolutely Free, Frank Zappa wasn't the only thing, it was a band, because that's how rock music presented itself in the 60s. After the Beatles, everyone wanted to be a group. Being a solo act would be like being Frank Sinatra or something not very fashionable. So I think the Mothers are crucial.
They were simply doing something that nobody else had done before. They were experimenting with lots of different styles, jazz, rock and roll, pop music, beat music, everything that went along, and they drew it all together and allowed everything else to follow on top from prog rock for a start.
The first Freak Out album baffled and amazed people. I suppose because of so many new techniques that he was introducing, editing tapes and speeding up voices, and everything seemed to be rather chaotic and explosive and frightening in a way.
It sounded almost alien in the landscape that it arrived. You had Brian Wilson was working on Pet Sounds at the time, while Frank Zappa was basically using tapes, cutting them up, using sound samples before the technology even existed. He was basically creating the kind of music that we're hearing today, but back in a time when it was very hard work, it was very visceral, you had to cut pieces up by hand.
So yes, the first album, Freak Out, was had a tremendous impact on musicians as much as it did on a rather bewildered public, I would say.
Freak Out, 1966. It's a fantastic debut, and the fact that it's a double album gives it a weight which is terrific. The only other rock album that was double was the Velvet Underground's first album, and that's coming out the same year. So it's saying, at last, rock people are getting hold of the big budgets and they can do something on a large scale. So the fact that it's double is just fantastic.
It was a bold step for any rock artist, as Zappa was perceived to be, to inflict it, really. I wouldn't say inflict it on the public, but it's a lot of music to take on, a lot of ideas, and obviously he needed to prove to people that he had so much bubbling under that he wanted to show this to the world, and one album was going to be enough. So it was a blockbuster double album.
With Zappa, there was a conceptual continuity running through the whole thing, which was a watchword of his entire career then onwards. It was this bizarre collision of different musical forms that basically were talking about the society at the time and the rise of the freaks, as it were, against the kind of the straight world, while still finding something to lampoon in the freaks. He wasn't allying himself completely with the counterculture because he saw that there was just as many sawdust Caesars in there as there were in Congress.
I think if Zappa had finished with Freak Out, he would have been an absolute cult. And in fact, his star kind of waned during the punk years, where writers for the music papers decided that Frank Zappa wasn't fashionable anymore. I think if only Freak Out had been made and it had no other success since then, he'd have been one of the undiscovered greats of punk rock. Because you look at that music and it's very like the kind of stuff which Lenny Kaye reissued as the Nuggets series. It's garage band music in many ways, although with a lot of extra stuff he's trying to do with it. But in some ways you can look back on it as a punk classic.
I think as a producer, Tom Wilson really brought in a kind of combination of vision and reputation. He had the kind of musical vision that the band needed. He'd worked with people like John Coltrane and Bob Dylan. He could see potential in something which at the time was very much from the avant-garde. And also he had the reputation from selling commercially Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel. And he saw the potential in the Mothers, and he gave them a platform.
Tom Wilson's role was very... the ability to let them loose in the studio and do what they needed to do, but then actually bring it together so that it sounded like a cohesive record, because they were a very anarchic act, obviously. I think the work that he did with Dylan, Soft Machine, Velvet Underground, I mean, he worked with a huge variety of very disparate acts, really. He didn't sit there and go, I'm like Phil Spector, everything's got to sound like Phil Spector, or it's got to sound like Tom Wilson. He let every act have their free range, and he did that with the Mothers, and that was why they were so respected, I think, because they were so different. They were allowed freedom.
He pretty much put his reputation on the line to get the band onto Verve, which, while it had been a jazz label, they were trying to move into the rock market by concentrating on stuff from the underground. And Wilson basically took what was an unpolished gem and turned it into the diamond that we later saw with Freak Out. It may have been really out there, but it still had just enough commercial potential to succeed.
I am in favor of armament. I am in favor of really sophisticated, nasty weapons to blow other people up. I believe in them. The only thing is that since a lot of these things are made in America, we don't know whether they'll work. because craftsmanship in American manufacturing is a thing of the past. We understand this.
You know, a lot of the problems that are facing our country today are economic, and I think that I found a really good way to straighten them out. Tax the churches.
And the biggest worry of nuclear war is not the fact that there are arms on either side. The fact is that when they start pushing the buttons, will our rockets that we made here actually fly over there, or will they just go up out of the hole and land on top of us? We don't know, you know.
Legalize all drugs and tax their use. Legalize prostitution and tax its use, and make sure the politicians get enough of what they really need.
I would feel a lot better about it if I got blown up by a Russian bomb than by an American bomb, wouldn't you?
And everybody who already has a job, do your job really good, do quality work. Your products will sell better than the things that are made overseas, and you'll create more jobs for Americans. Goodbye.
Well, people have called Zappa a darling of the underground, but if you think about it, he was actually very critical of the underground. This is what was so confusing when he first came to London. I remember meeting Frank when he arrived in London for a press conference in around at the end of 1967. And before he came, he was kind of built up as this monster figure. We'd all seen the album covers, the mothers all dressed in bizarre kind of drag, wearing sort of strange suburban American women's outfits from the 1950s. A very unprepossessing picture. And Zappa himself, with the moustache and the beard and the long hair and the thin, angular face, people were actually quite frightened or in awe of him. So when he showed up in London, naturally he was hot news. Everybody was talking about him. He was a key figure for the underground. He was like most hippies in London were rushing out to buy his albums. So it turned out to be quite funny when I actually met him and discovered that Zappa was quite hostile to the whole concept of the underground and hippies and flower power.
The hippie movement that was just starting then was very peace and love orientated, and I think that he came across and just rode over the top of that, really, but still allowed it to be part of what him and the Mothers of Invention were.
He would use his self-taught intellect to lampoon people from all directions. At the time when he played in New York, he brought on some people from the Marine Corps who were in the audience, and with very little encouragement, he got them to tear into some plastic dolls by telling them, you know, kill the goop babies, and making an incredible kind of political statement, while just basically letting people show their true colours. And he abhorred stupidity. He didn't suffer fools, whatever the length of their hair, gladly, and it's something that went all the way through his career. And I think the great thing about Zappa is he knew just how much rope to give people to string themselves up quite perfectly.
But it turned out that Zappa himself was this wonderfully warm, friendly and sensitive person. He wasn't the monster that we all feared from the album covers. And yes, it was very odd meeting him at this reception, because he produced a business card and it was my card, and he'd never been to England before, and I hadn't been to the States at that time, so how he got hold of my card and brought it with him, I've no idea. So I went up to shake his hand full of trepidation, and he said, "Hi Chris, how are you?" He'd already checked me out. So this shows how well Zappa was into the media and promotion and the press, and he knew what he was doing. You know, he was very up on everything, you know, so he knew who the press guys were in London. And so that was good, because it meant that we had this rapport and we could talk about the mothers in a much more, less fearful way. So I certainly appreciated that first meeting.
I feel that we're only in it for the money, although outwardly a direct lampoon of the whole flower power movement and the hippie movement, with that fantastic cover, which was a straight parody of Sgt. Pepper. There was more to it than simply lampooning, just tearing down, when really the target was so obvious and it was so easy to do. There was much more behind it. There was songs like Mom and Dad on there, which were quite touching in the way that he realised that the country was on the verge of falling apart. It was almost just basically seeing what was going to be happening in a couple of years' time when the anti-war movement did come up against the forces of straight society on the campuses, about a child, laying down to protest against the society that her parents stood for, and ending up killed by a stray bullet.
You did have the murders at the Kent State riot a few years later, which Frank Zappa is predicting. So Frank Zappa's looking at the hippie phenomenon and warning people about what could happen and where things are going in a way that has a seriousness and directness that I don't think even the Beatles managed.
I'd like to thank the people at the BBC for giving us a chance to do some of the things on television here that they would never let us do in the United States.
There was a lot of thought in Zappa's music. It does come across sometimes as just being funny, but there's a lot of depth to it as well. There was an incredible amount of musical depth on We're Only In It For The Money as well. While you had straight lampoons like Flower Punk going on, you also had the chrome-plated Megaphone of Destiny, where it was his second rather, after the return of the Son of Monster Magnet on Freakout, really looking into the kind of structures that Varese had already toyed with and bringing them into the present day.
In some of the tracks that he's doing bear comparison to experiments by Karlheinz Stockhausen or heavyweights of classical music, but it's all presented in a way which makes you actually listen to it rather than thinking, oh my God, here's a reference to something. You're not really aware of his sources when he's doing it. What you get is a confrontation with rock studios, paranoia, people whispering into microphones, the kind of sensations people get when they mix a rock album, which are often ironed out in pursuit of a nice polished product. And he used all those things creatively in a way to draw you into a vision of what was happening in America. And really he's trying to tell you about the dark side of what the hippie experiment could lead to.
The music, of course, was so chock full of ideas, and everything from, speeded up voices and guitar solos, heavy rock, doo-wop, satire, politics. Once again, you could sit down and listen to the album for hours and hours, or years and years, and still never quite get to the bottom of it all.
It was an album of great songs, some very inventive pieces, some great pieces of music. I think it was the look, the fact that it was a parody of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper in the terms of the way that it was presented in the cover, but bore no relationship to it in terms of the actual music on it. Although I suppose the chrome-plated Megaphone of Destiny was a bit of a taking the mickey out of A Day in the Life in a way, but no, I think it stood alone as a great rock album of its time.
After the success of the first three albums, or the impact of those albums, Absolutely Free, and We're Only In It For The Money, etc., and Freak Out, then came an album called Lumpy Gravy, which was billed as a Frank Zappa solo album, and really it was kind of orchestral, abstract instrumental music, and very hard going. I think that's probably why he put it out as a solo album rather than a Mothers band album.
An evening of warm, intimate musical entertainment.
It's pretty hard listening. Basically, a big lump of Varese-style musique concrète and things just crushed together, all different snippets of speech and sound, and coming on the back of his strongest commercial album to date, it would have been a disaster if it had come out as the Mothers of Invention.
We're Only In It For The Money actually had on the cover is this phase 1 of Lumpy Gravy. And I think Lumpy Gravy had is this phase 2 of We're Only In It For The Money. So they were linked together as such in the public's mind, but musically they were completely different. And I think Lumpy Gravy was just another way that Frank could express himself musically, because he had so much to give and he had so many styles that he picks up on, that it was an album that got that out of his system so he could move on again.
I must admit, listening to the album then and now, it was very hard work. I can remember spending many hours at parties, hippie parties, where everybody's lying on the floor, rolling joints on LP sleeves and trying to get into the music and coming away with a terrible headache. It was the sort of album that used to break up marriages, I remember, because girlfriends and wives were forced to listen to this dreadful exciting music blasting out from bed sits. You know, it's a sort of make or break relationship album, I think. It's interesting that whenever Zappa was at work, out on the road and touring and playing with his band, microphones were never far away and tape recorder machines. I don't know if the musicians themselves always appreciated it, because there'd be sort of grumbles about, hey, Frank's recording this gig. You know, I actually went on the road with the Mothers in England, and it was interesting to hear all the grumbles backstage.
He recorded virtually everything that he could record so that he could always use the best versions that he got of any of his songs, so that he could use them on future releases. It also means that rather than going into a studio and going over and over the same song again and again trying to get it right, by recording it every night of a tour, you'd end up at some point getting the definitive version.
He wanted to capture the excitement of the moment, great solos, the kind of interaction between an audience and the band, and all that magic, really, that you can only get at a live gig.
I think he realised, having come to a certain extent from the jazz tradition, that a lot of the live performances that the band were giving could never be replicated in the studio. And the way he was very forward-looking in cutting up different performances and gluing them all together in a sound collage meant that he didn't feel there was anything in any way cheating by capturing these live performances, snipping them out of something which may or may not have happened at the Fillmore, and then gluing them together with something that then happened in the studio. And it's great that he did, because otherwise these things would have been lost. You know, it's very hard sometimes when you're standing in a very clean, sterile environment, recording studio, to truly emote in the way that a lot of these players were in the live arena. And I think that's what Zappa was doing. He was just basically trying to get the best out of the Mothers of Invention, and that was the way he chose to do it. Zappa disbanding the Mothers at the beginning of the 70s had a lot less to do with financial constraints, which was probably brought up as the main reason to spare the blushes of the band, rather.
I think finance came into it, that Zappa could see various things he could do, and that basically employing people, giving them a full-time wage, quite a large group by that time, was a drain on his finances he could spend on something else. And it's the beginning of a kind of autocratic attitude, the first sign of it, because it was possible to love the Mothers of Invention and think of them as a kind of bohemian troupe like the Fugs. It became very clear when Frank Zappa disbanded the Mothers that he was in charge, he had the ideas, he employed them, he had that relationship to them. And so a kind of element of something rather capitalist and unpleasant seems to come in at that point. But Frank Zappa was always very clear about how he could achieve things, and it wasn't very sentimental about how to do it.
He needed technicians who could really play the kind of stuff that he was then composing. He was moving into the full-blown jazz rock stage of things, and he needed players that were impeccable and could follow the dots, and rather more than just being visceral and passionate, he needed people who could really, really read the dots, and that was why he had to kind of get rid of his old muckers and get in some people who were substantially good players.
Frank Zappa's ideas always ran ahead of what he could materially achieve. He was running one of the greatest underground bands, but he also had ideas of a concerto for a violinist like Jean-Luc Ponty. He had ideas for orchestral projects, he had ideas for films, and I think it was you can't really complain that Zappa should think, well, actually, it's a bit of a burden keeping all these guys employed when maybe they're not quite what I need.
One of the reasons Frank himself gave for breaking up the band, this is around about the end of 1969, as I recall, he'd just done a tour of Canada, and he said that he got fed up with people clapping and cheering bits that didn't deserve clapping and cheering. So in other words, he thought the audiences didn't really know what he was doing. They were making a lot of noise and cheering and yelling, but they were cheering and yelling for all the wrong bits. But that was at least the theory. That was the reason he gave for breaking up rather abruptly the much-loved Mothers.
I think when Hot Rats was released, it was moving away from the anarchy that he'd produced on his earlier records into a much more cohesive sound. Some great pieces of music there, Peaches on Regalia, G-Spot Tornado. They're superb pieces of instrumental music. I mean, so much so that, if I remember rightly, it was a top 10 album in this country. And I think it paved the way for him to move further away from the freak-out stuff of the early years and experiment more.
He was experimenting with a new 16-track recorder that he'd just taken delivery of, and Hot Rats really was, as he said himself later on, it was more of a experiment in overdubbing than anything else. While there is a lot of incredible music on there, Zappa was basically finding the possibilities of the new baby that he had and overdubbing, and the fact that it came out the way it did was possibly more luck than judgment. And Hot Rats itself became a very welcome commercial success for a man who was only then setting out on his own record label. He just got the Bizarre imprint going, and this was his first release, and it did extremely well for him.
This was a much more focused album. This was funky kind of jazz rock in a way, with some tremendous musicians, Sugarcane Harris on violin, and Captain Beefheart singing Willie the Pimp, which was a wonderful performance, and that really showed that kind of blues roots that they had, and they were getting serious, I think, with Hot Rats, which personally I liked it a lot. I thought it was one of my favourite Zappa albums, probably because it was more focused and there was less kind of clowning around and mischief making.
In the period of around 1969-1970, when Frank Zappa was doing well for his record label, they allowed him to set up a subsidiary called Bizarre and Straight, and on those subsidiary labels he found all sorts of really interesting acts, and I think the whole point about them is how singular they were. They weren't imitating Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was inspired by their own unique attitudes.
I think really if you look at the early people who recorded on Bizarre and Straight, like Tim Buckley, Wildman Fisher, Alice Cooper, various people. Basically, Zappa was doing exactly what Tom Wilson had done with him. Although his influence was there in that he gave these people a little more direction than they possibly had, he was just letting them go, letting them use their ideas.
He knew and admired these artists, and they're all very different. Tim Buckley, obviously, a great singer-songwriter, Captain Beefheart with his kind of bluesy, throaty voice, and Wildman Fisher, completely off-the-wall character. So it was natural, in a way, that Zappa would want to produce them and produce their albums. Whether he actually influenced them, I suppose he did, certainly with Wildman Fisher.
Well, he did spend 3 months in the studio with Wildman Fisher, which might have been a little excessive, but possibly it's because he needed more work than anybody else. But I think Alice Cooper pretty much did what they did, and you can hear far more Yardbirds in those early recordings than you can Frank Zappa. And yeah, I think Zappa was a visionary. He was also an enabler for people that he saw as common travellers, in that they were very much ploughing their own furrow, and that's basically why he signed them.
It's been suggested that when Zappa put his new version of the band together, the Mothers came back again, that they were more of a backing band. Certainly, rather than being individuals. Certainly that could well be true.
I think the new Mothers of Invention lineup, when it did come into being, wasn't really an equal part share in what was coming out. Zappa, as time went on, became less and less of a collaborator with people. I think really it was a benign dictatorship was what was going on in that band.
He tried to control them rather more. There would be long hours of rehearsals. There would be on the stage shows they would become part of the act too. So he would draw them into Zappa's own persona. So in that way they became rather like marionettes or puppets. He would be pulling the strings. So I think he really enjoyed that aspect of it.
While they were taken on really as employees, and the fact that they were exceptional musicians notwithstanding, a chemistry did develop between them, which you can hear on the Fillmore albums, and latterly it was captured in 200 Motels, that there was a great chemistry between the band. But I think those guys were in the band because of their skills on their particular instruments, and not because Zappa wanted to use them as a sounding board for any ideas. They were going to play what he wanted them to play. I think 200 Motels really got the Zappa brand out there. I mean, that was where people really got used to the trademark moustache and hair, and that was it. The people, suddenly he was allied to people like Ringo Starr and Keith Moon, and just people saw Zappa as more of a mainstream personality. People who had never really listened to his music in any great depth suddenly knew who Zappa was.
Once you enter into film, money seems to matter even more than it does in the rock industry, and 200 Motels bombed. It was a failure. It was considered incomprehensible. It became a cult movie. So I don't think it helped his career. In terms of Frank Zappa's own development as an artist, I think it's incredibly important. I think it's a unique film because most films work on narrative. They work with you falling in love with the hero or heroine at the beginning. Everything that happens to them, you think of them as happening to yourself. It's quite an easy track to plough. Most Hollywood is a pretty facile thing to do artistically. But 200 Motels is one of the only examples I can find of a film that works as a piece of music. It's a cantata. The whole thing is singing and music, and it starts and it rises up like a piece of music, and if you're musically inclined, you are completely entranced by it through the full 90 minutes.
I think it depends where you're coming from. I think with 200 Motels, it was a bizarre record. Personally, it was the last record of his that I bought. It signalled really the end of the whole of the freak out thing that he'd done. But it opened up a huge new market by casting Ringo Starr as Frank Zappa. This actually meant that all of a sudden the general public were aware of him. It enhanced his status on a global scale, but I think it lost him a lot of his original fans.
Well, 200 Motels was the great movie that never was, in a way. It was rather sad because Frank had this huge vision of things he wanted to do and achieve, and he was so enthusiastic and so full of ideas that I remember when I interviewed him once, I asked him about some music he'd written, and he sat down and began writing it out for me in pencil on some sheet music so I could see what he was doing, which just kind of blew me away, really, that he would take the trouble to sit down and start writing music for me. And in the same way, when he wanted to make a film, he invited me to see them filming at Shepperton Studios, and right away you could see there was no script, there was no real direction. Once again, like with his albums, we're often confused and almost too much being packed into it. And 200 Motels, which should have been a big, very funny kind of parody of life on the road with a rock band, the 200 Motels of a tour, suddenly got bogged down in good ideas that weren't achieved.
Although the film was beset with all kinds of disasters and catastrophes and was an enormous cash cow for Zappa, he ended up putting an enormous amount of his own money into it. And because he wanted to do instant editing and they wanted to see exactly what kind of product they were getting, it was the first film that was actually recorded onto video and edited on video before being transferred to 16mm stock. And with all these innovations came problems that he didn't really think he was going to get, and there's only so much commercial impact a film's going to make where you've got Keith Moon as a nun and a load of wild jazz musicians playing on stage and bordering on obscenity, because one of the parts of actually making the film, the only way he was going to get the film distributed was that he couldn't make it an X, so there was no way that he could have any really strong adult material in there, and at the time that was a lot of what the Mothers were about.
So I think artistically it's an extraordinary achievement, but because it's film, it sits weirdly among other films that people watch, and it won't deliver them what they want. So the average Mojo journalist's term for something like 200 Motels is anarchic, incomprehensible, boring. But I think that's because they haven't got their musical ears screwed on.
Really, it came together years later with Spinal Tap, was the film I think Frank was trying to make. And sadly, you really need discipline in movie making. It's all very well in the studio cutting up bits of tape and making funny effects, but when you've got a whole film to make, it's got to go somewhere. And it didn't have a scriptwriter and it didn't have a proper producer, so a bit of a disaster, really.
I think the fire that occurred in Montreux, the casino, which was documented later by Deep Purple in Smoke on the Water, was an incredible blow to Zappa, because his equipment that was lost in the fire, which was basically all of it, I think there's a great urban myth possibly that the only thing that they actually got from the rubble was a molten cowbell, which heartbreaking when you consider that there was a lot of material in the fire which wasn't just stuff you could buy off the shelf. These were custom built instruments. As he was working in new fields musically, he had equipment that he needed to actually make this music. He lost his own guitar, he lost keyboards that were custom built to his own design, and there was a lot of investment in that gear as well, and I think it was $48,000 worth of equipment he lost, which has got to hurt.
Well, it was typical in the aftermath that Zappa would turn around. Although Deep Purple had the big hit, Zappa himself actually released live recordings from that gig, so to produce an album. So in the end, he did actually manage to pluck some kind of result out of the ashes of the disaster.
Well, I think it's typical of Frank to release the tapes of anything that had some notoriety about it, and certainly the fire which destroyed all the equipment at Montreux, to put out the tapes of that was the right thing to do.
Well, in the series of disasters that befell Frank Zappa, I guess the worst thing that happened to him was in 1971 when he was doing a concert at London's Rainbow Theatre, the old Astoria where Jimi Hendrix had played back in the 60s, and for some reason, some ludicrous reason, a member of the audience leapt up onto the stage and pushed Frank off the stage into the orchestra pit.
For whatever reason, he said he wasn't getting his money worth, first of all, from the performance, and then he said he didn't like the way that Zappa was looking at his girlfriend in the audience. The guy was obviously a little deranged, but for whatever reason, this left terrible scars on Zappa. Physically, he was in an appalling condition. There were broken bones. He ended up in a wheelchair for a long time. He had a leg brace. He ended up with one leg shorter than the other, as we all know from listening to Zombie Wolf and later Dancing Fool. He could never leave himself out of his songs, and he was out of commission for a very long time, and he always had a kind of healthy disrespect for his audience, I think, and that only compounded it when one of them actually turned against him and put him out of commission for so long.
He never did another show after that without a bodyguard, so obviously he had a fear of it happening again, which I think is perfectly understandable.
I don't know much about dancing, that's why I got this song. One of my legs is shorter than the other and both my feet's too long. Of course, now right along with them, got no natural rhythm, but I go dancing every night, hoping one day I might get it right. I'm a dancing fool, I'm a dancing fool, I'm a dancing fool, I'm a dancing fool. hear that beat, I jump out of my seat, but I can't compete because I'm a dancing fool.
The fact that the Rainbow concert incident caused Zappa to be out of commission for so long was really the reason that that particular Mothers lineup dissolved. It wasn't for any other reason really than these are world-class working musicians, and they simply couldn't afford to be sitting around on a modest retainer while Frank got better, basically, and they had other fish to fry.
People ask themselves, did the accident at the Rainbow lead finally to the end of the Mothers of Invention? I think causation in history is complex, and it's mediated via people's opinions. So even if you ask Frank himself, you might get a different question depending on how he's feeling at different times. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to why the Mothers broke up. One thing is to look at 60s bands and what happened to them, that it's easier for an industry based upon publishing, selling records and the publishing system of getting back money, to be a solo artist. Keeping a band together, a cooperative, is extremely difficult. So I don't think Zappa's unique in going solo. You only have to look at many other examples, Van Morrison or David Bowie, or that being a solo act is a solution to a lot of the problems of trying that utopian project of being a band of equals.
I think the incident at the Rainbow Theatre actually kind of drew a line under his career at that point. From then on, you see him doing much more in the way of he moved into jazz a lot more, and much more sophisticated music. I mean, some of the targets that he'd been attacking as a composer before really become part of history. So there was a lot of reasons for moving on. Apart from the accident, there was a changing music world, a changing scene as well. And it was becoming increasingly hard for him to find an audience, I think, for the kind of stuff that he was doing in the 60s, satire and political statements. He was moving away from that more into becoming more of a muso, I think, more of a musician.
I think the jazz rock or the fusion elements there, that was another way that he got through a particular type of music, and it was very popular at that time. You had Miles Davis going into bringing rock music, electric guitars in. You had Weather Report starting. Jeff Beck was doing jazz rock albums. It was the way that music went at that time for seasoned musicians.
He'd already had his fun with rock and roll and the blues. Didn't need to prove how great a kind of a rock and roll guitar player he could be. And actually he was up there with Eric Clapton, and I always thought personally he was an outstanding guitar player. And he tended to use his technique and his ability and his ideas to focus them rather more on albums like One Size Fits All and Apostrophe. Those albums that appeared in the later 70s were, I suppose, more mature, reflected the kind of interest in jazz fusion. And also, of course, there were bands like Steely Dan appearing at that time too. So it was quite cool to mix genres, but with a more swinging, jazzy kind of flavour to it.
Rock and roll is about business, so Frank Zappa being one of the more interesting uses of the rock form than anyone else had to be a businessman. He made it very clear when he came to London, when the Mothers of Invention were the super freaks and the toast of all the drug heads of Camden Town, he carried a briefcase around with him. And there he was in a bowler hat, long hair, flared trousers and a briefcase, and this was commented on, and his point was, well, he had essential papers that needed to get signed and so on. So he was kind of warning people even then that this thing we're looking at that seems to be the epitome of freedom is actually based on hard business.
Frank was an incredibly shrewd businessman. I mean, he ran a very tight ship. I toured with him for 3 months, and he ran the whole show. He checked attendance figures against monies earned, about how much he was paying his musicians, how much even down to how much they paid the bellhops. I mean, he was right on the ball to every penny right the way down, because he was funding it himself. So obviously he had to be that good. He had an accountant on the road with him, he had a tour manager on the road with him, in order to make sure that it worked properly.
So much nowadays we see pop artists and rock musicians as puppets of the music industry, and Zappa was never a puppet. He was always the man in charge, the man coming up with the new ideas so fresh and advanced of their time, ahead of their time, that even now we're still learning from him.
I think the first period of Frank Zappa's music was hugely influential across a massive range of artists. I think an awful lot of people look back to people like Frank Zappa and Captain Beefheart and the Velvet Underground. They're always the names that are cited. He gave a freedom to musicians to do almost anything they want, to use any instruments that they wanted to use in what they were doing, to go off on any tangent that they could possibly come up with. And it put a freedom into rock music and into music in general that still exists to this day.